You remember the sound. That low, steady bubble coming from a clay pot on the back burner, the lid rattling just enough to let the steam curl through the kitchen. Your abuela never set a timer. She listened. She knew by the smell when the beans were ready, when the rice had caught the right color, when the broth had pulled everything it needed from the bone. That olla de barro was the most important tool she owned, and she treated it like it had a soul. Now, after decades of stainless steel and non-stick coatings, professional chefs across the country are circling back to what she already knew. Clay changes the way food tastes. It holds heat differently. It forgives. Here are 25 old Mexican clay pot recipes that chefs are finally calling genius. So hit subscribe, because some of these deserve a place back on your stove. Number 25. Mole Amarillo. In the valleys of Oaxaca, this golden mole was the one families made when the pantry was running low on dried chiles. It used chilcosal and chilhuacal amarillo peppers, ground with cumin, cloves, and a handful of hierba santa leaves, then thickened with masa and poured over chicken or chayote squash. The clay cazuela gave the mole its signature smoothness. The masa dissolved gradually in the gentle heat, binding with the pepper oils instead of clumping the way it did in metal. Cooks stirred it slowly with a wooden spoon and let the pot do the rest. The color deepened as it cooked, turning from pale yellow to a warm amber that stained the clay walls permanently. In Oaxacan markets, mole amarillo is still sold from clay vessels because the flavor changes when you make it any other way. The hierba santa wilts into the sauce so gently that it perfumes every bite without turning bitter. Chefs who have tried replicating it in stainless steel say the masa seizes too quickly, and the mole never reaches that velvety texture the clay version produces on its own. Number 24. Café de olla. This was not just coffee. It was coffee transformed by the pot it was made in. Piloncillo, a stick of canela, and coarsely ground dark roast went into a clay olla with water and simmered until the whole kitchen smelled like Christmas morning. The unglazed clay absorbed years of flavor, and families swore that the older the pot, the better the coffee tasted. In the ranchos of Jalisco and Durango, Café de olla was the first thing poured at dawn and the last thing offered to a guest at night. You drank it from a clay mug that matched the pot, and the warmth stayed in your hands long after the cup was empty. No paper filter, no machine, just fire, water, clay, and time. Trained baristas now study the extraction method and say the clay changes the mineral balance of the brew in ways no modern filter can replicate. Number 23. Asado de boda. In Zacatecas, this was the dish that appeared at every wedding feast, and it was always made in clay. Pork shoulder braised in a sauce of ancho and guajillo chiles, thickened with a little chocolate and sweetened with piloncillo. The combination of sweet and savory confused people who had never tasted it, but one bowl and they understood. The clay pot kept the sauce from scorching during the hours it needed to reduce into something dark and glossy. The pork absorbed that sauce until the meat and the liquid became almost the same thing. Chefs who have revived asado de boda for modern menus say the clay creates a braising environment so steady that the collagen breaks down perfectly without any monitoring at all. Number 22. Tatemado. From the coast of Colima, this was pork cooked in a sealed clay olla with dried chilies, vinegar, and spices until the meat collapsed into a tangy, deeply savory stew. The name comes from the Nahuatl word for something roasted or charred, and the dish lived up to it. The clay was sealed with masa dough to trap every drop of steam, and the pot went into a low fire or a pit and stayed there for most of the day. When the seal was broken, the kitchen filled with a smell that carried the sharpness of vinegar and the warmth of toasted cumin all at once. Chefs studying the slow cooking traditions of Western Mexico now call Tatemado one of the most underappreciated braises on the continent, and they credit the sealed clay vessel for the intensity of flavor no modern method has matched. Number 21. Pozole rojo. The hominy swelled slowly in the clay, splitting open over hours until each kernel bloomed like a tiny white flower. Dried guajillo and ancho chiles gave the broth its deep red color, and a pork shoulder dissolved into the liquid until the meat fell apart at a touch. In Guerrero and Jalisco, pozole was the centerpiece of celebrations, baptisms, birthdays, and saints' days. The clay pot went straight to the table, and everyone served themselves from the same vessel. Shredded cabbage, sliced radishes, dried oregano, and a squeeze of lime went on top, and the bowls were deep enough that you needed both hands to hold them. Chefs who specialize in regional Mexican cuisine say the clay changes the texture of the hominy in a way that no pressure cooker can match. That is what they are rediscovering now. Number 20. Pipian rojo. This is one of the oldest sauces in Mexican cooking, built on toasted pumpkin seeds ground with dried guajillo and ancho chiles, sesame, peanuts, and a stick of Mexican cinnamon. The paste went into a clay pot with chicken broth and simmered until the oils from the seeds rose to the surface, and the sauce turned a deep brick red. The clay held the heat low enough that the pumpkin seeds never scorched. In metal, the natural oils burned within minutes and left a bitter aftertaste that ruined the whole batch. The porous walls absorbed just enough fat to keep the sauce from breaking, and the slow evaporation concentrated the flavors until a single spoonful tasted like it had been cooking for days. Families in Puebla and Oaxaca served it over turkey or pork for celebrations, and the pot it was made in was often passed down because the seasoned clay carried the memory of every previous batch into the next one. Number 19. Barbacoa de cabeza. This is one of the recipes chefs study most closely, because no modern technique has been able to fully replicate what happens inside a sealed clay pot buried underground. The whole head of a cow went in, wrapped in maguey leaves, placed into a clay vessel, and lowered into a pit dug that morning. Mesquite coals lined the bottom. The pit was covered with earth and left overnight. Nobody checked on it. Nobody adjusted the temperature. The earth did the work. By dawn, the cheek meat, the tongue, the cachet, all of it had braised in its own fat and steam until the connective tissue dissolved completely. The flavor was not just beef. It was smoke, earth, and maguey all at once. In northern Mexico and across the Texas border towns, barbacoa was a Sunday morning tradition that shaped the rhythm of the entire week. Families lined up at the carniceria before sunrise, and the best batches sold out within the hour. You learned which vendor to trust, and you showed up early or you went home empty-handed. The tortillas were made fresh, the salsa verde was ground in a molcajete, and everything was eaten standing around the truck bed or the kitchen counter. No plates needed. The grease soaked through the brown paper and nobody cared because the first bite made you forget everything else. Today, restaurants serve barbacoa made in steam ovens and pressure cookers, and it is good. But chefs who have gone back to the original pit and clay method say the texture alone proves why this recipe survived for centuries. The meat does not just fall apart. It dissolves on the tongue, and the fat carries the flavor of the earth itself. Number 18. Carne con chile colorado. Dried red chilies, usually ancho or New Mexico chilies, toasted on a comal until they blistered, soaked in hot water, and blended into a smooth paste. Cubed beef went into a clay cazuela with that paste, a little garlic, a pinch of cumin, and nothing else. The clay held the heat low enough that the beef braised in the chili sauce for hours, without the bottom ever burning. In the border towns of Chihuahua and Sonora, this was an everyday supper, spooned over flour tortillas still warm from the comal. No rice, no beans on the side. Just meat and chile and bread. Chefs who work with dried chilies now say that clay mellows the capsaicin gradually during the braise, producing a warmth that builds in layers instead of hitting all at once. Number 17. Menudo rojo. The olla was enormous. In some families, it was the largest clay pot in the house, tall enough that a child could barely see over the rim, and it only came out for menudo. Beef tripe cleaned and cut into small squares, went in with dried guajillo and ancho chiles, hominy, oregano, and a few cloves of garlic. The pot simmered from Saturday night until Sunday morning. Nobody set an alarm. The smell woke the house. The clay held the broth at a temperature so low and so even that the tripe softened without turning rubbery, which is the line every cook fears crossing. Too hot, and the tripe tightens into something you cannot chew. Too cool, and it never breaks down. The clay found the middle and stayed there for hours without anyone adjusting the flame. Across Chihuahua, Sonora, and the border towns of South Texas, Menudo was the Sunday morning ritual that organized the entire weekend. You started buying the tripe on Friday. You cleaned it Saturday afternoon. The pot went on after dinner and stayed on the stove through the night. By dawn, the kitchen windows were fogged, and the broth had turned a deep brick red from the chilies. Bowls were set out with chopped onion, dried oregano, crushed red chili, and lime wedges. Families served themselves and ate standing at the counter or sitting on the porch, and nobody talked much until the first bowl was finished. Cooks who now feature menudo on weekend brunch menus say the clay pot version produces a broth so clean that the pressure cooker version tastes flat beside it. The tripe comes out tender enough to cut with a spoon, and the hominy blooms fully in a way that only hours of gentle clay heat can achieve. Number 16. Caldo tlalpeno. Named after the town of Tlalpan on the southern edge of Mexico City, this soup combined shredded chicken, chickpeas, chipotle chiles, epazote, and chunks of avocado in a clear broth that looked simple, but carried a slow, smoky heat that built with every spoonful. The clay olla kept the broth at a bare simmer for hours, which let the chipotle dissolve into the liquid without overpowering it. In a metal pot, the heat came on too fast, and the chipotle turned sharp and acidic before the chickpeas had time to soften. The clay version produced a broth so clean you could see through it, yet so layered that the smokiness hit the back of the throat a full second after each sip. Families ladled it into bowls and dropped in slices of avocado and a squeeze of lime at the table. Cooks who have gone back to making it in clay say the broth develops a body that no amount of stovetop reduction can match. Number 15. Mole de caderas. Once a year, in the Mixteca region of Puebla and parts of Oaxaca, the goat slaughter season began, and this dish appeared. The hip bones and ribs went into a clay olla with dried chilhuacal and castaño chiles, avocado leaves, green beans, and chayote. The broth simmered slowly until the marrow melted out of the bones and enriched the liquid with a depth that no other cut of meat could provide. The clay drew the fat gently from the marrow without scorching it, and the avocado leaves released a faint anise flavor that hung in the background of every spoonful. Mole de caderas was a seasonal event, not a year-round meal. Chefs who travel to the Mixteca for the annual festival say the clay olla is what makes the broth taste like the hillside where the goats grazed. Number 14. Chamorro en chile ancho. A whole pork shank, bone-in, browned on all sides and then lowered into a deep clay olla with a sauce of ancho chiles, garlic, a little piloncillo, and a splash of pulque. The lid went on, and the pot sat on the lowest flame the stove could hold for the better part of an afternoon. The clay kept the braising liquid at a temperature where the connective tissue around the bone dissolved into gelatin so slowly that the meat stayed on the shank in one piece until you touched it. Then it fell, not shredded, not pulled. It just gave way, like the bone had decided to let go on its own. the sauce reduced into a dark glaze that clung to the meat and pooled on the plate. In the fondas of Michoacán and Guanajuato, Chamorro was the special of the day that sold out before the lunch rush ended. The clay pot sat behind the counter, and the woman running the kitchen portioned each shank by hand, spooning the sauce over rice and ladling a little extra into a clay bowl for the broth. The bone went on the plate, and regulars knew to crack it open for the marrow. Nobody ordered a side dish. The shank was the meal. The tortillas were warm and came in a cloth-lined basket, and you tore them with one hand, while the other held the bone. The table was small, and the napkins were thin, and nobody cared. What mattered was that the meat tasted like it had been cooking since before you woke up, and in most cases, it had. Chefs who feature braised shanks on their menus now say the clay produces a gelatin-rich broth that coats the mouth in a way no enameled pot can match. The porous walls absorb the sharpest notes of the chile and return a warmth that lingers long after the plate is clean. Number 13. Birria de chivo. In Jalisco, families slow-cooked goat in a sealed clay pot buried under coals or set over the lowest possible flame for hours, until the meat turned so tender it separated from the bone with a nudge. The marinade was a thick paste of guajillo and ancho chilies, cumin, oregano, cloves, black pepper, ginger, and vinegar, rubbed deep into every cut of meat the night before. The clay lid was sealed with a ring of Asado to trap every wisp of steam inside. The sealed clay created something no metal pot could replicate. The moisture cycled in a closed loop, basting the meat continuously, while the chili paste reduced into a concentrated consomme that collected at the bottom. Families cracked the seal at the table, and the rush of fragrant steam was part of the ritual. The broth went into small cups for dipping tortillas, and the meat was piled onto plates with raw onion, cilantro, and lime. Metal pots let too much vapor escape through the lid gap, so the broth turned thin and the meat dried at the edges. Cooks who still make birria in clay say the consommé has a body and richness that takes a Dutch oven twice as long to approach, and even then, it never quite gets there. Number 12. Dulce de calabaza. Pumpkin or calabaza cut into large wedges, layered with piloncillo cones and cinnamon sticks inside a clay olla, and cooked so slowly that the sugar melted into a dark syrup, and the squash turned translucent and soft enough to eat with a spoon. This was a Day of the Dead offering and a late autumn treat across central Mexico. Families placed it on the ofrenda alongside pan de muerto and marigolds. The clay held the gentle heat that kept the calabaza from falling apart too early, and the syrup pooled at the bottom of the pot like liquid amber. Pastry chefs who have rediscovered this recipe say the slow conduction of the clay caramelizes the piloncillo in a way that no oven or saucepan can duplicate. Number 11. Lentejas con plátano macho. Lentils cooked in a clay pot with diced ripe plantain, tomato, onion, and a little chipotle. The combination sounds unusual if you have never tried it, but the sweetness of the plantain against the smokiness of the chipotle is one of the most satisfying flavor pairings in Mexican home cooking. During Lent, when meat was off the table, lentejas became the main meal in households across Puebla and the Bajío region. The clay pot held the heat steady enough that the lentils never split into mush, and the plantain melted into the broth, and gave it a body you could not get from any other ingredient. Some families added a few pieces of pork sausage on ordinary days, but the Lenten version with nothing but lentils and plantain was the one people remembered most. Cooks who feature plant-forward menus now point to this dish as proof that depth of flavor never required meat in the first place. Number 10. Carne en su jugo. Thinly sliced beef, seared fast, then dropped into a broth made from roasted tomatillos, whole pinto beans, bacon, and cilantro inside a clay olla. The name means meat in its own juice, and the clay made that name literal. The porous walls drew the beef juices into the broth while keeping the beans firm and separate. In Guadalajara, this was the dish you ordered at the fondas near the market at midday. The clay pot came to the table still bubbling, and you ate it with warm corn tortillas and sliced avocado. Chefs who serve carne en su jugo outside of Jalisco say the clay vessel is what keeps the broth clean and light instead of heavy, because the pot breathes in a way that metal refuses to. Number 9. Estofado Oaxaqueño. Chicken pieces braised in a clay cazuela with a sauce of ancho chiles, tomatoes, raisins, olives, capers, almonds, and a stick of canela. The mixture of sweet, salty, and savory confused anyone tasting it for the first time. But in Oaxaca, this was wedding food, celebration food, the dish that appeared when something important had happened, and the family wanted to mark it. The clay held the heat so gently that the raisins plumped without bursting, and the almonds softened without turning to paste. The sauce darkened as it reduced, and the chicken took on a flavor that sat somewhere between a mole and a Mediterranean stew. Chefs who trace the colonial influences in Oaxacan cooking say the clay cazuela is what keeps estofado from becoming a confusion of flavors. The pot mediates. Number 8. Pollo en adobo. Chicken pieces browned on the comal and then lowered into a clay pot filled with a sauce of guajillo and ancho chiles, garlic, oregano, cumin, and a splash of vinegar. The adobo clung to the chicken as it braised, and the clay kept the temperature so even that the skin stayed intact, while the meat underneath turned tender enough to fall from the bone. In households across Michoacán and Guanajuato, pollo en adobo was the Sunday meal that could stretch to feed whoever showed up unannounced. Extra tortillas, extra broth, another chair at the table. The leftovers went back into the clay pot with the lid on, and by the next day the adobo had soaked deeper into the meat and tasted even better reheated. Chefs now say the clay absorbs the vinegar's sharpness over the long braise, producing a smoother, rounder adobo than any Dutch oven delivers. Number 7. Frijoles puercos. In Sinaloa, this was the loaded version of everyday beans, and it only worked right in a clay pot. Black or pinto beans simmered for hours in an olla de barro until the broth turned thick and creamy on its own, without mashing. Then came the layers. Crumbled chorizo fried until it rendered its red oil, strips of roasted poblano, chunks of queso fresco, sliced tomato, and a generous pour of the chorizo fat right back into the pot. The clay held the heat so evenly that the bottom beans caramelized slightly without scorching, and that caramel layer was the part everyone fought over. In a steel pot, those bottom beans burned flat and stuck. In clay, they turned nutty and dark, almost like a crust, while the top stayed soupy. Families served the pot in the center of the table, and everyone scooped from their own side, getting a different ratio of cheese to chorizo to crust with every spoonful. The pot went back on low heat between servings, and each round tasted a little deeper than the last. Number 6. Nopales en chile rojo. Cactus paddles cleaned of their thorns, diced, and simmered in a dried chili sauce inside a clay pot. The nopales released a sticky liquid as they cooked, and the clay absorbed just enough of it to keep the texture from turning slimy. That was the trick. Metal pots trap all the moisture, and the nopales stew in their own slime. Clay breathes, and the difference shows up on the plate. A little onion, garlic, and a pinch of cumin were all it needed. In the arid regions of San Luis Potosi and Zacatecas, nopales were free food, growing wild on every hillside. Chefs experimenting with desert ingredients now say the clay pot method solves the one problem that has kept nopales off fine dining menus for decades. Number 5. pollo en escabeche oriental. In the Yucatan, this was the chicken dish that appeared after every holiday because it tasted better the day after it was made. Chicken pieces poached in a broth of bitter orange juice, white onion, garlic, black peppercorns, oregano, and whole habanero chilies, then rested overnight in a clay cazuela where the acidic broth slowly penetrated the meat without breaking it apart. The clay absorbed the sharpest edge of the bitter orange, leaving a pickle that was tangy but never harsh. The habanero floated whole and unbroken, lending its heat to the broth without the burn of a crushed chile. Families in Valladolid served it at room temperature, with pickled red onions and warm tortillas. Chefs who study Yucatecan preservation techniques say the clay pot is what turns escabeche from a sharp pickle into a gentle brine. Number 4. Atole blanco. Ground corn dissolved into water, sweetened lightly, and stirred over low heat in a clay jarro until it thickened into a smooth, warm drink that tasted like the grain itself. No chocolate, no fruit, no vanilla. Just corn, water, and a little sugar. It was the oldest version of atole, the one closest to what indigenous communities made long before the Spanish arrived. Mothers gave it to teething babies because it was gentle and warm and filling. Grandmothers drank it before bed. Field workers carried it in clay jarros wrapped in cloth to keep it warm through the morning. Chefs working with heritage grains now say that atole blanco, made properly in clay, reveals the flavor of the corn itself in a way that no modern cooking vessel allows. Number 3. Habas guisadas. Dried fava beans soaked overnight and simmered in a clay olla, with dried guajillo chiles, a few sprigs of cilantro, and a branch of epazote. The clay held such a gentle heat that the beans cooked through without their skins splitting, which is exactly what happens in a metal pot when the water boils too hard. In the highlands of Puebla and Tlaxcala, habas were one of the oldest cultivated crops, grown in the same fields as corn and squash. Families ate them mashed on tortillas or spooned from the pot with the broth. Chefs who study heritage legumes say the clay vessel is what keeps the skins intact and the texture creamy, producing a bean that tastes almost buttery without any fat at all. Number 2. Arroz con leche. In nearly every Mexican household, this rice pudding was made in a clay pot on the back burner, stirred slowly until the milk reduced into something closer to custard than soup. White rice, whole milk, a stick of cinnamon, a strip of orange peel, sugar, and sometimes a handful of raisins. The clay pot kept the temperature just below a boil, which was the entire secret. Milk scorched fast in metal because the thin walls created hot spots, but the thick clay walls spread the heat so gently that the milk thickened without ever forming a skin or catching on the bottom. Grandmothers stirred it with a wooden spoon and knew it was done when the spoon left a trail that closed slowly. The pot came off the heat and the arroz con leche kept cooking inside the clay for another 20 minutes, the residual warmth finishing what the flame had started. Served warm with a dusting of ground cinnamon, or chilled overnight in the same pot, so the rice absorbed every last drop of sweetened milk and turned almost solid. Families who switched to aluminum said it tasted flat, like the pot itself had been adding something all along. Number 1. Tamales steamed in a clay olla. Before aluminum steamers existed, tamales were cooked in tall clay ollas, with a bed of corn husks at the bottom and water just below. The steam rose through the husks slowly and evenly, and the masa set without drying out. The result was softer, more fragrant, and slightly earthier than what comes out of a metal pot. In every region of Mexico, the tamalada was a family event. Dozens of hands spreading masa, filling, folding, stacking. The children sneaked bites of raw masa when nobody was looking. The clay olla sat in the center like the heart of the whole operation, and the steam curled out from under the lid for hours. Chefs who have tested both methods say the clay produces a masa with a tenderness and aroma that metal simply cannot deliver. That smell, wet clay and corn and steam rising together, is what made it feel like a celebration and not just cooking. These 25 recipes were never written down in most families. They lived in the hands of the women who made them and in the clay pots that held them. If your abuela cooked in one of these pots, you already know what these chefs are just now figuring out. Which of these recipes do you remember from your own kitchen? Tell us in the comments. If this brought back a memory, hit like and share it with someone who grew up eating this food. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. We will see you in the next one.